Welcome to Thread of Terror. We bring you the creepiest stories from Reddit. Dim the lights, grab a blanket, and hit subscribe so you never miss a scare. What conversation or interaction with a physically normal stranger left you wondering if you'd just talked to something non-human or supernatural? Story 1. The woman who gave me purpose, then vanished.
There was a young woman, about my age at the time, early 20s, sitting alone in a nearly empty coffee shop. She appeared to be holding back tears, so I decided to approach her and asked if I could sit with her. We ended up talking for hours. The conversation was a mix of deep and light topics, about everything and nothing all at once. While she did not go into much detail about what was troubling her, it was clear that she felt hopeless. I did my best to encourage her. I told her not to give up and shared reasons why holding on was worth it. I even suggested a few ideas that might reignite a spark of hope within her. As the coffee shop prepared to close, I wrote down my phone number on a napkin and handed it to her. I told her I would love to see her again and that she could reach out to me anytime. That is when she looked at me and said something that left me speechless. She told me everything you said to me tonight was not for me, it was for you. What she did not know was that I had been battling my own demons. I had gone to the coffee shop that night with the intention of planning how to take my own life. Talking to her had shifted my focus. I realized that if I could help someone else not feel the way I did, then maybe I could hold on a little longer. She not only saved my life that night, but she also gave me a purpose. Her presence inspired me to find hope, and now, years later, I work as a therapist, helping people find light during their darkest moment. As she got up to leave, she hugged me and walked out the door. A moment later, I realized she had forgotten a napkin with my number on it. I quickly ran outside, only seconds behind her, but there was no sign of her anywhere. It was as if she had vanished into thin air.
Story 2. A stranger in the park.
It was a winter evening, and I had stayed late at work, leaving around 7 p.m. The streets were already dark, and the cold air was heavy as I decided to take a shortcut through the park to get home more quickly. I hesitated briefly, knowing the park was poorly lit and not the safest route at night, but the prospect of saving time ultimately swayed me. As I entered the park, the shadows seemed to stretch endlessly, and every sound was unnervingly amplified. A few minutes in, I noticed a group of people walking behind me and another group ahead. My heart began to race, and anxious thoughts spiraled through my mind. What if they are planning to confront me? I tried to remain calm and scanned for a safer area. Up ahead, I spotted a lamppost with a CCTV camera. If something happens, at least there will be evidence, I thought grimly. I made my way to the lamppost and stopped beneath its light. It offered a faint sense of security, even though the tension lingered. Suddenly, out of nowhere, a tall woman jogged toward me and stopped right next to me. She was strikingly tall, much taller than my 6-foot frame, and her presence was unexpected. Before I could process her arrival, she smiled and asked, "Is it all right if I walk with you?" Though surprised, I nodded and managed to say sure. Okay, I guess. As we walked together, she began talking about how unsafe the park could be at night. Her calm and casual conversation was oddly comforting, even though the situation felt unusual. She walked beside me all the way to the park's edge, chatting as if we were long-time friends. When we reached the end of the park, she smiled again and said, "Have a good night." Before I could properly thank her or even ask for her name, she turned and jogged back into the darkness of the park. I stood there for a moment, stunned and bewildered. In the weeks and months that followed, I walked through that park daily, hoping to spot her again. But I never saw her. To this day, I remain convinced that her presence that night prevented something bad from happening. The encounter felt surreal, an enigmatic act of kindness that has stayed with me, a reminder that sometimes the universe sends help in the most unexpected forms.
Story 3. The mythical pool partner who never returned.
It was a typical Friday night, and I found myself at my usual college dive bar, the kind of place that filled to capacity with young, energetic crowds eager to relax after a week of classes. The atmosphere was lively laughter and conversations mixed with the distinct sound of pool balls clattering on tables. For me, this bar was not just a place to unwind, it was my domain. I was a regular at the pool table, known for my skills, and for often walking away with free drinks, beers, and sometimes even cash. I loved the game, the precise aim, the feel of the cue in my hands, and the thrill of victory. Most weekends, I paired up with a random partner to play twos, challenging other duos, usually confident college kids who thought they could beat us. Winning added to the fun and gave me a sense of accomplishment. This particular spring evening, the bar was busier than usual, and I was on the lookout for a partner. Suddenly the door opened, and in walked someone who immediately caught everyone's attention. He stood out completely. A man in a perfectly tailored tuxedo with neatly combed white hair, polished dress shoes, and an air of composure. He appeared to be in his late 70s, a stark contrast to the casually dressed college students filling the room. He seemed almost otherworldly, as if he had stepped out of a gala and into our dive bar by mistake. Intrigued, I approached him and asked if he wanted to play. To my surprise, he smiled and agreed. From the moment he held the cue, it was clear this man was no ordinary player. He moved with precision and grace, sinking shot after shot without hesitation. It was as though I was playing alongside a pool legend, or perhaps something even more extraordinary. Word spread through the bar, and soon groups of challengers were lining up, eager to test our skills. Some even bet money, confident we would eventually lose. But no matter who stepped up to play, we remained undefeated. The man in the tuxedo was flawless. His accuracy was unmatched, and I could barely keep up with his skill. It was surreal, almost as if the game bent to his will. As the night went on, we continued to dominate until the bar began to close. As we wrapped up, I shook his hand, deeply impressed and a little awestruck. I could not resist asking him where he had come from. He simply smiled, his eyes glinting with a hint of mystery, and walked out into the night. I stood there for a moment, hoping to see him again, but he disappeared as suddenly as he had arrived. I continued going to that bar every weekend, but I never saw him again. That one spring night remains etched in my memory as a once-in-a-lifetime encounter. Whether he was just an extraordinary player or something more, I will never know. But one thing is certain, he turned an ordinary night into an unforgettable story.
Story 4. The man who made me feel like prey.
This story is difficult to explain, but I still get shivers when I think about it. He was a customer I was helping. Honestly, there was nothing that really stood out about him. He was handsome, but in a regular way. He dressed normally, spoke normally, and was blandly friendly, just the typical behavior you expect from a stranger. He seemed like an average, upper middle class guy. The only thing that really caught my attention were his blue eyes. Not in a strange or supernatural way, they were just an exceptionally striking shade of blue. For some reason, though, he made every hair on the back of my neck stand up. Alarm bells went off in my head, and all I could think was, I need to hide. I've never felt that way before or since. Even when I've been followed home by someone, I've never felt the same deep, gut-wrenching sense of danger that I felt with this man. After ringing him through, he reached out to shake my hand. This was uncommon in my experience, but out of politeness, I took his hand and shook it. Instantly, I felt so nauseous that I almost gagged. The moment I started to feel sick, he held my hand firmly and smiled. There was something about that smile that made me absolutely sure that he knew exactly what I was feeling, and he was enjoying it. I'm not a religious person, but in that moment I remember thinking, oh no, is this the devil? After he left, I still felt so sick that I had to go to the back and sit down for a while to calm myself. I'm not sure if he was a serial killer or what, but to this day I've never had an encounter even remotely similar to that one. I absolutely felt deep in my bones that I was in danger. It felt like I was prey. It's a difficult story to explain because it's based entirely on emotions, so I haven't shared it with many people. But to this day, it remains one of the most terrifying and strange experiences I've ever had.
Story 5. The Silent Watcher.
It was a late shift at the store, and I was working the register by myself with only a few customers still browsing. The store was quieter than usual, and my supervisor was nearby, doing her usual tasks. Everything seemed normal, until I looked up and saw him. He stood a few people behind my current customer, and as soon as our eyes met, a wave of unease washed over me. I can't even describe it properly. There was this dark aura around him, like a black fog that seemed to swirl and shift. I had never seen anything like it before, and have never seen it since. It wasn't just his presence that made me uneasy. It was something about the way he stood there, watching me. I kept glancing at him from the corner of my eye, trying to make sense of what was happening, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. When I looked up again to take care of the next customer, I was shocked to see that the strange man was now standing right in front of me. But that wasn't the strangest part. The entire line had vanished, and the store, which had been bustling just moments before, was completely silent. My supervisor was gone too. She wasn't anywhere in sight. It was like the whole world had shifted, leaving just the two of us alone in this empty space. The man had long, unkempt brown hair and average looks, but his eyes were something I couldn't stop thinking about. They were a piercing blue, almost unnatural in their clarity. When I asked what I could help him with, he immediately responded, requesting a very specific brand of cigarette. I didn't even finish my sentence before he interrupted me, and there was this strange, knowing grin on his face that made my skin crawl. As I turned to grab the cigarettes, everything went black. It wasn't a blink or a momentary lapse. It felt like the world around me just disappeared, and for what seemed like minutes, I couldn't see or feel anything. In that moment, all I could think was, "Oh God, this man is in my head," and that feeling of dread deepened. When my vision finally returned, I saw him again, his grin unchanged. He laughed this eerie laugh, as if he knew exactly what I had just experienced. It was a laugh that felt like it resonated deep within me, like he had control over my thoughts, my very mind. He just turned and walked away, and as soon as he left, everything snapped back to normal. The line was full of customers again. My supervisor appeared as if nothing had happened. The store was bustling with noise again, and it was like the bizarre encounter had never occurred. But I knew something was wrong. I felt like I was still reeling from the experience. For days after that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. I couldn't get his eyes out of my head, and every time I closed my eyes, I could see him watching me. It was like he was still there, following me, waiting for the next moment to strike. The nightmares began that night, each one filled with his eyes blue, cold, and all-knowing, always watching. They were so vivid. I woke up in a cold sweat, heart racing, certain that I wasn't alone. The strange occurrences didn't stop there. Little things started happening. Objects would be moved. Things that were supposed to be in one place would be gone, and strange sounds would echo in the house when no one was around. It was like his presence lingered, hanging over everything I did. It wasn't until about a week later, when the nightmares finally stopped, that the strange events started to subside. It was like whatever grip he had on me was slowly loosening. But I'll never forget that feeling, the sensation that I was prey, that something was out there watching, waiting for its moment. It's an experience that has stayed with me, and every time I think about it, I still get the chills. Whether it was a hallucination, some weird mind trick, or something much darker, I'll never know. But it remains one of the most terrifying experiences of my life.
Story 6. The stranger who turned out to be real.
This actually happened recently. A man was on the side of the road fiddling with his bike, and I could see that the chain had jumped off the gears. I know a decent bit about bike maintenance, and I had recently been feeling guilty for passing people stranded on the road, so I stopped. The man was clearly on some stimulants, not entirely in a good state of mind, but he was very polite and thankful as I examined the situation. I realized it wasn't just a simple chain off. The chain was all twisted in the wheel. I needed a few tools. Fine, my place is down the block. We start walking there, and this guy is just talking non-stop. Anybody familiar with stimulants knows the random high-energy rambling I'm talking about. But the subject matter was heavy. His wife was in jail, and he was worried about taking care of his hearing-impaired daughter, but he was thankful they had just received state-of-the-art hearing devices, and I could watch the video on YouTube. He mentioned that he was checking himself into rehab next week because he hadn't been able to hold his plumbing jobs down due to his drug use, and on and on. It was this type of continuous rambling as I worked on his bike. At some point, I commented on how nice the bike was. It was an old school mountain bike with top tier components, carbon fiber, everything. Super expensive shocks. Honestly, I assumed it was stolen, and everything he was saying was just a nervous, fabricated story. He claimed the bike was his wife's and that she used to be a pro racer in the early 2000s. I still thought it was a cover story, but the timeline and the age of the bike did line up. Anyway, I got the bike fixed and wished him well. He rode off into the sunset, and I immediately went inside to look up his name. I found him on Facebook, and everything he said was true. I found the video of his daughter receiving hearing implants and saw a much healthier version of him in the frame. I found out he had been a plumber for years, and up until very recently, all his pictures showed him not using stimulants. I found his wife, who had recently gotten a DUI and was in jail, and I found her history as a competitive mountain biker in the 2000s. I guess he wasn't an alien, but meeting him was definitely bizarre, and something I'll never forget.
Story 7. A mysterious stranger.
It was a quiet evening in my small town in Central Europe, where not much ever happens, and the few black people who live here are easy to spot because they're so rare. I was feeling pretty down about a girl who'd been on my mind a lot, so I decided to take a walk and grab some kebab to cheer myself up. While waiting in the queue, I noticed a woman sitting at a table in the pub next to the kebab stand. What immediately caught my attention wasn't just the fact that she was black, something that stood out in this area, but also that I had never seen her before. I had lived in this small town my entire life, and I was always around this pub, so it felt strange to see someone so unfamiliar. Even more curious was the fact that she wasn't ordering anything. She was just sitting there by herself quietly. As I waited for my kebab, the woman leaned over the fence that separated the kebab place from the pub and made direct eye contact with me. She smiled slightly, and to my surprise, she offered me an ice cream. It seemed like a kind, random gesture. A little unsure, but also intrigued, I accepted the ice cream, and as I took it from her hand, she looked me in the eyes, smiled again, and said, "I love you." I wasn't sure how to process it. The moment was surreal and unexpected, and I had a sudden rush of emotions, comforted and confused all at once. Then, as quickly as it had all happened, I received my kebab, turned around, and looked for the woman, but she was gone, vanished without a trace. She wasn't at the table anymore, and I couldn't find her anywhere in the pub. I was left standing there, holding the ice cream she had given me. It seemed perfectly fine, and the package was intact. I took a bite, and it was surprisingly delicious. A little sweetness that felt like a reminder of kindness when I needed it most. The whole experience was so strange that I couldn't stop thinking about it. Who was this woman? Why did she give me ice cream and say I love you? Was it just a coincidence, or did she somehow know I needed to hear those words? All I know is that it felt like something magical had happened, like a kind stranger had come into my life for just a moment, lifted my spirits, and then disappeared as quickly as she had appeared. Maybe it was just a strange interaction, or maybe it was the universe's way of reminding me that kindness exists even when we least expect it. I'll never really know who she was or why she did it, but I'm glad I'll always have that moment to remember.
Story 8. Strange lights and an ominous warning in the mountains.
I used to live in a very old house in the hills of western Maryland. It only had windows in the front and back of the house, not on the sides. When I asked about it, I was told that houses were built this way back then so that the slaves walking between the houses couldn't look inside. We were renting from a family friend who owned the place, and before we moved in, we were warned that the house was special and that we should be prepared for that, though no explanation was given as to what special meant. I came to find out that the house was, I won't say haunted, more like enchanted. Strange things happened there a lot. The strangest by far happened a couple of months before I moved away. Across the street there was an open field that quickly turned into foothills, and about 300 yards further on became a tall ridge of mountain. There was some kind of antenna on top of the ridge, and it had a light that was always on at night. No blinking, just a steady white light all the time. One evening I went outside to use the bathroom. Yeah, he had an outhouse, and happened to notice that the light on the ridge was off. I walked down the driveway a bit because I thought maybe there was a tree blocking it from this angle or something, but I was stopped dead in my tracks. Suddenly, the entire sky behind the ridge lit up. It was like someone had turned on extremely bright floodlights, and they were reflecting off of snow to an overcast sky or something, but there was no snow on the ground, and it was not even slightly overcast. It was eerily quiet, even more than usual. Well, now I was really curious, so I continued walking down the driveway to see if I could get a better angle on it. That's when I saw a man come around the curve of the street from the left and approach me at a quick walk. This is a fairly remote neighborhood with only 2 other inhabited houses on the street, so it was unexpected to see anyone walking. As he got close enough, he said, "You don't want to go over there," in a cautioning tone. Well, it's not like I was planning to climb the mountain in the dark, but I asked why. What's going on? Trying to keep it conversational. Couldn't say, he said, but you don't want to be a part of it. Well, if you don't know what's going on, how do you know I don't want to be a part of it? I asked. That's pretty weird. I gestured in the direction of the ridge and noticed the light was fluctuating a bit, like a slow pulsing. No, that's weird as hell, and I'm a curious person. The man then shifted to a darker, more ominous tone and said, "Your eyes are not meant to see." The way he said it made me think you meant human, and in retrospect, it was definitely a warning, maybe even a threat, and it almost sounded like some sort of ritual pronouncement. But I was oblivious at the time. I looked back up at the light and said, "Well, I can see it just fine. What's the problem?" But when I looked back down, the man was gone. In the span of maybe 5 seconds, he had disappeared. There was no direction he could have gone. No matter how fast he was running, that would have taken him out of my line of sight in that amount of time. I was already kind of freaked out by the weird lights, but this really pushed my anxiety to the limit. I went back inside and explained to my roommate what had just happened, encouraging him to come out and see for himself. But by the time we got back outside, whatever was going on behind that ridge was over. I figured that guy was just off his rocker, and that there must have been something entirely normal going on over there. So I went online and looked at Google Maps for the area. There was nothing on the other side of that ridge. No roads, no buildings, no signs of civilization whatsoever, just a blank spot on the map. I switched to satellite view and saw nothing but more wooded ridgelines behind it. To this day, I have no idea what was going on or why I was warned away from it, but it feels like I was sent some kind of messenger to keep me from blundering into something terrible.
Story 9. The goodbye that came before the heart attack.
In 1997, when I was 8 years old, I lived with my younger brother, who was 4 at the time, in a home where our grandparents often came over for dinner. It wasn't unusual for them to stay after we went to bed, and before leaving, they would come to our room to kiss us goodbye. One summer night, I woke up to find my granddad sitting at the foot of my bed. It was not an uncommon sight, as he would often visit us before leaving. I greeted him with a simple, "Hi, Granddad. Are you leaving now?" He replied, "Yes, I'm saying goodbye for now," and kissed me on the cheek. He then moved to my younger brother's bed, kissed him as well, and left. Something in my gut told me that he was a little sad, though he didn't say anything to suggest why. The next morning, I walked into the kitchen to find my mum crying. She told me that my granddad had passed away suddenly from a heart attack during the night. I was shocked and confused. I told her, "How can that be? I saw him last night. He came and said goodbye to me." My mum explained that my grandparents had left shortly after I went to bed the previous night. I also realized that my granddad had said goodbye, not good night, which struck me as odd. Though the news of his sudden passing was devastating, I couldn't help but feel comforted by the memory of his visit. Even though I was so young, that moment has stayed with me all these years. It's one of the few memories from my childhood that I can clearly recall, and I often find myself reflecting on it. It felt like a strange, perhaps unexplainable moment of closure, a farewell that I didn't quite understand then, but that I now cherish as a special part of my childhood. The memory of that night remains one I won't ever forget.
Story 10. The strange encounter at the 4th of July party.
A little over 20 years ago, my friends and I went to a 4th of July party at the house of a guy they went to high school with. It started out pretty chill, but as the night went on, it turned into the kind of party I didn't think actually existed outside of an 80s teen movie. Huge house in a rich neighborhood with no regard for property damage. Imagine the party at the end of Weird Science, minus the mutant bikers, but with a couple hundred teens and young adults, half of whom were on LSD and many of whom had carloads of fireworks. At some point, 2 men showed up. Nobody knew who they were. They didn't speak to anyone, not even each other. They didn't eat or drink anything. They didn't try to interact with anyone at all. What they did do was creep everyone out. They appeared completely average. Average height, average looks, average build, ambiguous age and ethnicity. Forgettable in every way, except they radiated an unsettling aura of darkness and hostility. They would stand on opposite sides of a room, glaring at each other for a while, then move to another room to continue glaring. They seemed to communicate through their intense, silent stares. It was as if some kind of malevolent force was barely contained within them. If they entered a room where you were, it felt as though the air grew heavy and oppressive. At some point, my friends and I decided to leave and check out another party in the mountains. A couple of other people we knew headed to a different party in the opposite direction, about 30 miles away. About halfway to our destination, we stopped at a gas station to get some drinks and cigarettes. When we walked out, those same two men were there, standing by their car, perfectly still, just staring at us. I don't think I've ever been that freaked out. We quickly piled into our car and sped off. Thankfully, they didn't seem to follow us, and we never saw them again. A few hours later, we returned to the first party to find a girl we knew sitting on the floor, holding a baseball bat, visibly jumpy and ready to swing at anything that seemed threatening. Apparently, those men had become even more terrifying after we left. No one would go into detail, but everyone who stayed at the party looked deeply shaken. The next day, I ran into one of the people who had gone to the other party. They had the exact same encounter with the same two men at a gas station, about 50 miles away from where we had stopped. Meanwhile, the people who stayed at the original party insisted the men didn't leave until hours after we saw them at the gas station. It was all incredibly eerie. I still don't know who those guys were or what they wanted, but I have serious doubts as to whether they were truly human.
Story 11. The 8-year-old who was too mature for his age.
When I was around 8 years old, I became friends with a kid who still fascinates me to this day. He wasn't from my school, nor was he from the only other school in town. One day he showed up at the end of school and started playing with my friends and me, just like any other kid would. He was kind, polite, and well-groomed, but it seemed like he had no family. He never spoke about his parents and avoided any discussions related to family. There was an orphanage nearby, but friends who lived there confirmed that he wasn't part of it. There was something strange about him, though, in a way that was hard to explain. He was mature for his age, displaying emotional intelligence that most 8-year-olds don't possess. He had a unique ability to understand others' feelings and articulate them well, but he kept his own emotions hidden. His voice was smooth and calm, unusual for a child, and he often sparked deep conversations that were well beyond what we would normally discuss at that age. I still remember the way he comforted a friend who had lost his grandmother with words that seemed eerily perfect for the situation. Despite his maturity, he was unaware of many popular cultural references, such as cartoons or TV shows. We introduced him to things like WWE, and Dragon Ball, and he became an avid fan. The only time he acted like a typical child was when we asked him about his own life. He would give vague, humorous responses that made little sense, which now, in hindsight, I'm sure he did, intentionally. I really admired him, though he wasn't a leader in any traditional sense. At that age, being weird could isolate a kid, but with him, his weirdness was captivating. He was cool in a way that was completely different, and I couldn't help but look up to him. My mother also found him odd, despite his politeness. Years later, she told me that while he was nice and well-behaved, he didn't seem like a typical child to her. There was something unsettling about him. He stayed in our group for about a year, and during that time, I formed great memories with him. Then one day he just stopped coming around, and no one saw him again. The more I think about him, the more strange things seem. I get the feeling I met someone extraordinary, or perhaps something otherworldly. Although I'm not particularly into supernatural theories, this kid has made me consider the possibility of things beyond the ordinary.
Story 12. 2 eerie encounters with electric blue eyes.
This is a story I've shared before on the strangest things you've ever seen thread, and I'm hoping someone else might have had a similar experience. Back when I was a sophomore in college, I walked into my math class like any other day and sat in my usual spot, about 4 seats in on the 3rd row. Although we didn't have assigned seating, there was always a girl who sat 2 seats to the left of me, with an empty seat between us and her male friend sitting next to her. They seemed to be good friends, always laughing and having fun, and nothing about them seemed unusual. On this particular day, I sat down, got my spiral notebook and pencil out, and just sat there quietly, thinking about what I was going to do after class. Suddenly I got a strange, unsettling feeling, and when I looked up to my left, my heart almost stopped. The girl was staring directly at me with a blank expression on her face, and her eyes were glowing with a bright, piercing electric blue, almost like lasers. It was completely unnatural. I can't really explain it fully, but I was paralyzed, unable to move or speak. Eventually I blinked and looked forward, and when I looked back, the girl had turned her head back to her friend, who was talking. About 2 years later, I was in a car with friends on our way to a restaurant. It was rush hour, and traffic was building up, so we were stopped in the right lane. I was sitting in the back seat when I happened to glance up, and to my left, through the windshield, I noticed a car next to us, its back bumper parallel to our front bumper, so I could clearly see the driver. He was turned almost completely around, staring directly at me. His eyes were the same piercing, bright blue, just like the girl's. I froze again, just like the last time I eventually managed to blink, look away, and then when I looked back, the man had turned forward and the light turned green, so we all started moving again. It's been about 15 years, and I've never experienced anything like that again, but it really messed with my mind for a while.
Thanks for joining us on this terrifying adventure. If tonight's story gave you chills, let us know in the comments below and share your own scary experiences too. Don't forget to leave a like if you want more nightmares and subscribe if you haven't already. Until next time, sleep tight and remember, not all shadows are empty.